Another significant aspect of life for the East Roman Empire was its relationships with the Latin West. This is really a narrative of tension and missed opportunities, I think. There is a rivalry between, um, especially the Carolingian Empire and the East Roman Empire, as a rivalry about which one of these truly represents Christendom or truly represents their idea of what civilization itself is. The rivalry really has a root in the coronation of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III. Uh, the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne really wants to lay claim to it as a Christian commonwealth that is the true successor to the Roman Empire and the legacy of Rome. Uh, they think their cause is helped by the fact that Rome falls under their sphere of influence, of course. Charlemagne tries many different ways to lay claim to the entirety of the Roman Empire, including the Greek speaking portions under the East Romans, by marrying into the Byzantine or East Roman royal family. In return, the East Roman Emperor Michael I does accept Charlemagne as what he calls Basileus of the Franks, which that means king of the Franks, while Michael keeps for himself the traditional title Basileus of the Romanoi, or the king of the Romans for himself. Right? Remember that Constantinople is the relocated capital of the Roman Empire per Constantine. So Michael really sees himself as a successor to Rome. Now, there are various levels of intermarriage between these two dynasties, and there is military and financial aid exchanged between them. And so there is this effort to create a sort of common Christian political identity between these two spheres. But in the end, they are unable to come to have a united front or any sort of meaningful cooperation between the two. There are very complicated power dynamics that also exist, especially around ecclesiastical positions. So, for example, the East Roman Emperor based in Constantinople frequently appeals to Rome to help the emperor have authority over the Eastern patriarchs in places like Antioch or Jerusalem or Alexandria. Uh, the Pope often accepts in his own turn imperial aid from Constantinople to recognize his status as the patriarch in the West in order to gain a foothold against Western rivals. So see emperor and pope both working off of each other to have their own status enforced or elevated by having the other entity engage within some of their own internal dynamics within their spheres of influence. Now, the patriarchs in the East often try to resist interference from Constantinople, and so then they often come to resent how the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, supports the emperor's interference. And this happens over and over again where there is strained relationships or sometimes temporarily ruptured relationships between the two. But this is never quite seen as a definitive break. But there is a schism that happens in the year 1054 that does eventually become interpreted as symbolic of a break between Rome and Constantinople. This starts under Pope Leo IX, who is a reforming pope. He is very interested in wide-scale church reform, and we'll be looking at his activities a little bit more next time. And he's especially interested in enforcing clerical celibacy. Now, the patriarch in Constantinople, the Bishop of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, he is interested in gaining his own position by attacking the Latin practice of using the Filioque clause of the Nicene Creed. That is the clause that says the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. He also is quite upset at the use of unleavened bread in the Western churches, whereas in the East, leavened bread was used. This is quite an obscure controversy to us now, but was quite definitive for establishing Western versus Eastern identities. So part of Leo's effort here is he wants to assert his authority over the church in Constantinople. So he sends legates or representatives to Constantinople, led by a cardinal named Humbert of Silva Candida. The goal here is to force Cerularius to renounce his title as ecumenical patriarch, to accept Rome as the primary patriarchal see, to permit Latin priests who were serving in Constantinople, being attached to various diplomatic missions and merchants and stuff, to allow them to use the Latin Western church liturgies, and to also condemn supposed heretics that were living in Constantinople. So it's really a whole-scale attempt to get the Patriarch in Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, to submit to papal authority. Not surprisingly, Cerularius refuses to go along with any of these requests, and so the papal legates excommunicate Michael Cerularius. Cardinal Humbert actually walks into the liturgy that the Patriarch is about to celebrate and puts the letter of excommunication he has drawn up in the name of the Pope on the altar itself. Quite dramatic. Of course, Michael Cerularius simply in turn excommunicates the legate. Now, the status of the excommunication of Patriarch Michael is actually quite doubtful, because by the time the excommunication is pronounced, unbeknownst to everyone, Pope Leo has died. And in turn, Michael Cerularius does not actually excommunicate the Pope, he only excommunicates the legates, or the Pope's representatives. But this moment in 1054, although at that time is not a definitive moment of schism, is now read by historians as symbolic of a gradual drifting apart of Latin and Greek churches over centuries as the separate institutional church structures develop, as the linguistic divide between the two expands, and thus as the theological comprehension of each other also expands, and as differing spiritual practices begin to emerge, different points of emphasis in the spiritual life. Now, this history still is ongoing. While the anathemas that were leveled against each other were lifted in 1965 at the end of the Second Vatican Council, there is still no communion between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Church bodies. And this issue still rests with the question of whether or not papal primacy, the authority of the Pope over all other churches, should be recognized or not. This question of authority is one that we're going to keep on tracking. It's worth noting that it's really in the 11th century that these questions really start come to the fore around papal authority. All right, with this, we're leaving behind Constantinople for a while, and we're going to shift our attention next to thinking about the Church of the East and how it comes into contact with Chinese culture.